Okay, so picture this for a second. The United States Navy is actively choking off like 20% of the world's oil supply.
Right, in the Strait of Hormuz.
Exactly. And the president is publicly threatening to start dropping bombs again. But then, on that exact same day,
Literally the same day.
practically in the same breath, he is sitting in a studio with Joe Rogan, signing an executive order to give hallucinogens to military veterans. I mean, welcome to April 2026.
It is an absolutely staggering sequence of events to process. I mean, when you lay those data points out right next to each other, it feels, completely surreal.
It sounds like a random headline generator just totally broke.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the mission of today's deep dive. We're looking at a text titled Calculated Chaos, the Strategic Method of Trumpian Disruption.
Right, which is a fascinating read.
It really is. And our goal today is to dissect how the author of this material takes these massive, seemingly totally disparate events and strings them into a single, cohesive geopolitical strategy.
Yeah, connecting the dots.
Right. And look, you are listening to this right now, and depending entirely on your own politics, this text either sounds like a complete masterclass in high-stakes negotiation, or it sounds like a terrifying descent into madness.
Oh, absolutely. It's incredibly polarizing stuff.
Yeah, so just a quick disclaimer up front. Our job today isn't to tell you which one of those it is. We are not taking sides here at all.
No, not at all.
And we aren't endorsing any of the viewpoints in this text. Our objective is strictly to, impartially map out the author's architecture so you can see the blueprint for yourself and understand how this specific methodology is actually designed to work.
And to see that blueprint, you really have to temporarily suspend your daily partisan reactions.
Yeah.
Just look at the underlying mechanics.
Right. Look past the noise.
Exactly. Because the author's core thesis is that what the cable news networks are calling, erratic madness is actually a highly specific, totally repeatable method for manufacturing leverage where absolutely none existed before.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start by grounding this in the primary example the author uses from right now, April 2026, the escalating standoff with Iran.
Right, the Strait of Hormuz situation.
Yeah. So the text notes that conventional peace talks with Iran recently collapsed in Pakistan. Instead of, issuing a strongly worded diplomatic memo or something, the response was a massive U.S. Navy blockade of the Strait of Hormuz.
Which is a huge escalation.
Massive, along with a strict Wednesday deadline and the very public threat of renewed bombing if a long-term deal isn't reached. And then Iran briefly tried to reclose the strait themselves.
Which didn't last long.
Right, prompting the administration to declare that America, quote, can't be blackmailed.
Right. And we really need to look at the physical and economic mechanics of that move to understand the author's point here. Because the Strait of Hormuz is only about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point.
Wow, that is narrow.
Yeah, it's a massive choke point. So when a blockade is announced there, the U.S. Navy doesn't necessarily have to start actually shooting at commercial vessels to shut it down.
Oh, really? Why not?
Because the mere presence of the blockade and, the threat of kinetic action, it causes global maritime insurance premiums to just skyrocket instantly. Lloyd's of London and other major insurers essentially refuse to cover oil tankers going through that specific choke point.
Oh, wow. So the shipping just freezes organically because the financial risk is way too high.
Exactly. And that traps roughly a fifth of the global oil supply. I mean, the text points out that previous administrations really relied on standard tools when talks failed, right?
Take sanctions.
Yeah, economic sanctions, literal pallets of cash, or what the author calls finger wagging. But the source asserts that those conventional methods never actually stopped Iran's nuclear progress or their funding of proxy attacks.
Right.
So this doctrine completely abandons conventional diplomacy to make the daily status quo absolutely unbearable for Tehran.
So it's basically like a high-stakes game of chicken. But in this version, one driver actively rips the steering wheel out of their own car and just throws it out the window.
Yeah, exactly.
So the other driver absolutely has to swerve. You're forcing the opponent's hand by visibly removing your own ability to back down quietly.
Right.
But, reading this, I kept wondering about the actual psychology here. Because how does throwing the steering wheel out the window force a negotiation instead of just causing a massive catastrophic crash?
Well, the author identifies that perceived madness as the core mechanism of the strategy. Like, it is not a bug, it is the central operating feature.
The text actually calls this Madman Theory 2.0, right?
Yes, exactly. The explicit goal is to make adversaries truly believe the leader is unpredictable and willing to go, much further than a traditional status quo politician ever would.
The original madman theory goes back to Richard Nixon, doesn't it? Like during the Vietnam War.
It does, yeah. Back in 1969, Nixon really wanted the Soviet Union and North Vietnam to think he was volatile and just obsessed with stopping communism, to the point where he might actually use nuclear weapons.
Wow.
He even ordered nuclear-armed B-52 bombers to fly toward the Soviet border in an operation called Giant Lance, literally just to spook them into forcing North Vietnam to the negotiating table.
Okay, so Nixon did it kind of quietly, through military signaling, but the text suggests this 2.0 version is entirely different because it is so incredibly public.
Oh, very public.
Yeah, the source even quotes an observer on X who summarized the dynamic as, quote, crazy respects crazy.
That public, almost performative aspect is completely crucial. The source actually aligns this tactic with the 48 laws of power.
Oh, really?
How so? Well, you mirror the enemy's unpredictability and aggression, but the reason it doesn't immediately result in a crash, like you mentioned earlier, is that you are mirroring that aggression from a position of overwhelming structural strength.
Oh.
You can act completely irrational, but your position is anchored by the most powerful military and economy in the world.
So you have this massive shock absorber that the other driver just doesn't have.
Exactly.
And that Wednesday deadline at the Strait of Hormuz plays into this perfectly, I think. The text links that artificial clock directly to the negotiation tactics outlined in The Art of the Deal.
Right, because setting an artificial clock amplifies the drama and forces a prioritization of resources. I mean, in any negotiation, if there is no deadline, the weaker party will just stall.
They just bleed the clock.
Exactly. By imposing a highly publicized Wednesday cutoff, you create this focal point of intense pressure. You force the opponent to the table before that clock runs out, which allows you to negotiate from a position of immense strength, or you just walk away entirely.
And the source uses the immediate market reaction as proof that the pressure campaign actually works in real time. I mean, commercial shipping eventually resumed, markets rallied, and oil prices actually fell once the leverage was applied.
Right, the outcomes.
But I have to interject with some heavy skepticism here. Because if your entire strategic framework relies on adversaries, genuinely believing you might indefinitely blockade the global oil supply or, drop bombs, what happens to your credibility if you don't follow through?
That's the big question.
Right. Because the moment you flinch, the madman persona just collapses. Does the text address how he maintains this crazy tightrope walk?
Yeah, it does. If you read between the lines of the text, the author is essentially arguing that you cannot be a madman abroad if you are a Boy Scout at home.
Oh, that's an interesting way to put it.
Right. To maintain the credibility of this disruptive persona internationally, you have to demonstrate that exact same relentless willingness to shatter norms domestically.
Ah, okay. So they're connected.
Completely.
Right.
The foreign policy tactics aren't isolated at all. They are one wing of a much broader methodology playing out during the first 15 months of this second term.
Which perfectly bridges the gap to the domestic battering ram. Because if you were trying to convince the Middle East that you do not care about the traditional rules of engagement, signing a highly unorthodox executive order on American soil certainly reinforces that image.
It absolutely does.
And that brings us to the April 18 executive order accelerating psychedelic research.
Yes. Specifically, the use of ibogaine for military veterans suffering from PTSD. The text cites this as a really prime example of internal disruption mirroring external disruption.
Let's talk about the mechanics of why this is so disruptive. Because ibogaine isn't just like medical marijuana.
No, not at all.
It is a very intense, naturally occurring psychoactive substance, and it carries massive cardiac risks. Like people can experience severe arrhythmias.
Right, it's serious medicine.
So the traditional method for getting a treatment like this approved involves a grinding bureaucracy. You're looking at FDA Phase 1, Phase 2, and Phase 3 clinical trials, safety reviews, and congressional funding debates that can easily take a decade.
It's a notoriously slow process.
It's like navigating a highly regulated toll booth.
Right. The conventional diplomatic channels of domestic health policy.
Yeah, exactly. But an executive order bypasses that entirely. It is the equivalent of driving an armored truck straight through the toll booth barrier.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
And the detail that really highlights the author's point is the setting. Because it wasn't signed in the Oval Office with the regular White House press corps. It was signed with podcaster Joe Rogan standing in the room.
Which is just, yeah, the author describes it as flashy and controversial, but notes that it delivers a highly visible, immediate win for the political base.
Right.
By bypassing the FDA to directly address veteran suicide with a novel treatment, it proves you are willing to bulldoze the entire administrative state to get a result.
And doing it with Joe Rogan is honestly a masterclass in the psychology of spectacle. I mean, you aren't just passing a policy, you are shifting the cultural center of gravity. You are humiliating the traditional establishment media and the medical bureaucracy in front of an audience of, what, 15 million listeners?
At least, yeah.
The spectacle is the leverage.
And that is the essence of what analysts in the source call the shock doctrine. It's an intentional, systemic reset. You see it in the territorial rhetoric, throwing allies off guard.
Oh, like the casual mentions of buying Greenland or controlling Panama.
Exactly. And you see it in the aggressive use of tariffs. The goal is always to shock the system out of its complacency.
Right.
The text argues the ultimate aim is to end endless wars and bureaucratic stalemates on better terms, rather than just accepting the perpetual half measures that regular diplomacy and standard governance produce.
And the blueprint reveals that this armored truck approach is happening without the traditional safety nets, too. Because the text mentions the aggressive expansion of federal reach regarding immigration enforcement and the systemic firing of inspectors general.
Right, clearing out the old guard.
Yeah, and the key differentiator the author notes between the 2017 to 2021 term and this current period is the internal staffing.
That's a huge point. The text observes that the internal guardrails have basically been removed.
Yeah. Right.
There are currently far fewer so-called adults in the room acting as bureaucratic friction against these really aggressive moves.
But, demolishing established norms like that, whether you're blockading international waters or bulldozing FDA protocols, it generates massive pushback. And the text doesn't just ignore the critics, does it?
No, it outlines the counter case explicitly because the deep divide in how these actions are perceived is actually central to the author's whole thesis.
Okay, how so?
Well, the text acknowledges that to a vast portion of the public and the diplomatic corps, this strategy feels entirely rails off. Critics look at this behavior and see pure ego, cognitive decline, and a series of rambling threats rather than a cohesive strategy.
They just see chaos.
Exactly. They look at the sheer volume of executive orders and the public feuds and see utter dysfunction.
And the critics aren't just complaining about tone either. I mean, the source mentions accusations of dictatorship and wrecking the global order.
Right, very serious charges.
And realistically, when you are playing a game of chicken with a fifth of the world's oil supply, people are absolutely going to panic about the global order. The real-world danger of that blockade isn't just theoretical.
No, and the text acknowledges those risks are intensely real. I mean, escalation with Iran over the Strait of Hormuz could easily cause a massive, sustained spike in global energy prices.
Right.
It could drag allied nations into a kinetic conflict they actively want to avoid, or just spiral completely out of military control. Furthermore, the source notes that domestic approval ratings regarding the economy are already taking a significant hit, specifically due to the war-related market volatility this strategy creates.
Okay, so if economic approval is dropping, and the risks of a global military spiral are that immediate and that real, how does the author possibly defend driving the armored truck through the toll booth?
Well, the author defends it by arguing the critics are fundamentally misunderstanding the metric of success here.
Interesting.
The text suggests there is a polarization filter at play. It posits that the media and political opponents frame every bold, disruptive move as unhinged, largely because they fundamentally reject the underlying policy goals to begin with.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, they reject the America First doctrine, and they are deeply uncomfortable with skepticism toward multilateral institutions like the UN or NATO.
So they hate the destination, which makes them scream about the driving.
Haha, yes, that is the author's contention exactly. The text argues that there is really only one test that actually matters in this framework: outcomes.
Just the results.
Just the results. And to prove this point, the author points back to the results of the first term. Despite the constant perception of chaos back then, the text lists the concrete results, like no new wars were started, the administration achieved record low Black and Hispanic unemployment, secured a state of global energy dominance, and normalized relations between Israel and several Arab states via the Abraham Accords.
So the author is basically telling the reader to look at the final score, not the penalty minutes accrued during the game.
That's a great way to put it. And if we look at the architecture of this argument, the source is essentially saying that geopolitics is being treated exactly like a high-stakes commercial real estate negotiation.
Okay, break that down for me.
In a brutal real estate deal, you leverage every single asset you have. You aggressively squeeze the timeline. You completely ignore the other side, complaining about your hostile tone or your unfair tactics.
You just don't care about their feelings.
Exactly. You focus entirely on the final contract. And in the context of the April 2026 Iran crisis, the text points out that the maximum pressure campaign resulted in a reopened shipping lane and resumed talks.
Right.
It did not result in the apocalyptic World War III scenario the critics confidently predicted.
I mean, I understand the real estate parallel the author is drawing there, but I really have to push back on the long-term viability of that conclusion, based on what the text itself admits about the economic damage. If presidential approval on the economy is already dropping just from the sheer volatility of these public threats, does the source imply there's a breaking point?
Like a limit to the chaos.
Yeah. Is there a moment where the sheer chaos of the negotiation costs more than the resulting deal is actually worth?
Well, the text implies that as long as the United States holds overwhelming asymmetric military and economic leverage over its adversaries, the threshold for that breaking point is incredibly high.
Because of that shock absorber.
Exactly. The author's thesis rests on the idea that the underlying structural strength of the U.S. acts as a permanent shock absorber for the volatility. The madness keeps everyone off balance, but the leverage ensures that when the dust finally settles, the U.S. dictates favorable terms.
Wow.
If the Iran deal lands well, the text concludes it will be yet another undeniable data point that this abrasive, disruptive method simply works better than traditional diplomacy.
Okay, so bringing this all together for you, the listener, what we have explored today is how this source recontextualizes what feels like daily exhausting political whiplash.
Right.
From a massive naval blockade in the Middle East and artificial Wednesday deadlines to signing executive orders bypassing the FDA on psychedelic research with cultural figures like Joe Rogan.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. But the author of Calculating Chaos argues none of this is random.
Yeah.
It is a unified, highly intentional doctrine. It is Madman Theory 2.0, utilizing maximum public pressure and transactional leverage to force a systemic reset both abroad and at home.
And it is a highly valuable mental model to keep in your toolkit, regardless of where you personally stand on the political spectrum.
Absolutely.
Whether you love these policies or you absolutely hate them, understanding this framework allows you to look past the immediate panic of a cable news chyron. It lets you analyze the actual leverage being applied, the bureaucratic structures being bypassed, and the concrete outcomes being negotiated.
It fundamentally changes how you read the news. You stop looking at the noise and you start looking at the mechanics. But I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Okay.
Something that builds directly on the text's central analogy, but explores a massive blind spot in that logic, I think.
Let's hear it.
The author argues that this strategy works because geopolitics is being treated like a high-stakes real estate negotiation, right? You apply unbearable pressure, you threaten to walk away, and eventually the other side folds because they want to save the deal.
Right, because the assumption in real estate is that everyone at the table is ultimately a rational economic actor trying to maximize their own financial value.
Yes. But there is a fundamental, terrifying difference in the ultimate downside.
Oh, definitely.
In commercial real estate, if you use a high-pressure tactic, you throw the steering wheel out the window to prove you won't yield, and it fails. The worst-case scenario is a collapsed deal. You walk away, you lose some capital, maybe your ego is bruised.
The fallout is purely financial.
But in geopolitics, especially when you're blockading 20% of the global oil supply and publicly threatening to drop bombs, the equivalent of a blown deal isn't just lost capital. It is an uncontrollable, kinetic military conflict.
Right.
If the entire crazy respects crazy doctrine fundamentally relies on the counterpart eventually swerving to avoid a crash, what happens to the calculated chaos playbook on the day an adversary decides they actually don't care about their own bottom line?
What happens when they call the bluff and they just don't swerve?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Can a high-pressure real estate tactic survive an opponent who isn't playing a rational economic game? When you have already thrown your steering wheel out the window to prove you absolutely will not back down, what do you do when you realize the driver in the other car is perfectly willing to die in the crash?
That is a terrifying thought.
It is something to think about the next time you see a jarring headline. Until next time.